Hello everyone, Shalom Aleichem. Forgive my delay. I had to attend a levaya, Rahman al-San, of somebody who just passed away overnight. So I was delayed, and please forgive me for this delayed time. The title of today's shir is Rosh Hashanah by the Rebbe. Think about it, Rosh Hashanah by the Rosh B'nai Yisrael, by the Rebbe. You can imagine how incredible that experience would be. And it was always incredible. There was never a year where it wasn't, where wir es darf zu sein. Rosh Hashanah really began, Chodesh Tishrei began in Chai Elul. And Chai Elul, there was a Farbrengen every year on Chai Elul. Sometimes it can be on Shabbos, when there's a 3-day Yom Tov, Rosh Hashanah, Thursday, Friday, and Sukkot, Simchas Torah, 3-day Yom Tov. Then Chai Elul would be on Shabbos. When Chai Elul was on Shabbos, there was always a Farbrengen. And then from Tafshin Lamed Beis and on, there was a Farbrengen in the weekday as well. Chai Elul, you really started feeling the Tishrei feeling. And a lot of times in Chai Elul, if you go back to read or listen to the Chai Elul Farbrengens, you can tell a lot about the coming year from them. And the first Orchim also would come for Chai Elul. Reb Mendel usually would be in town for Chai Elul. Reb Zusha would be in town, and groups would start by Chai Elul. Chai Elul was the beginning of Tishrei. And the Chai Elul Farbrengens were very, very geschmack. It was, you really felt there was something happening here. And Chai Elul Lamed Zayin, before Tishrei Lamed Ches, there was a very big shturim about Chodesh Tishrei. In Yud Gimel Tishrei, the last Farbrengen before Shmini Atzeres Tavshin Lamed Ches, when the Rebbe had the Maaseh with the heart, over there you can mamish feel like it's a Simchas Torah Farbrengen. But even Chai Elul, there were already quite a few Ramazim. And the biggest remez of all was when the Rebbe sang Tzoma L'chol Nafshi. And the Rebbe sang Tzoma L'chol Nafshi, he would sometimes change the words of the Tehillim to, I guess, it's a Himmel Dikazach, you can't explain it, but in Das Tachten, at least the way we could possibly understand it, the Rebbe was changing the words according to what was needed over there at that time. And in that Farbrengen, the Rebbe sang, Lirais Nafshi Uchvaydi. Came back, Lirais Nafshi Uchvaydi. To see myself, basically to see, the Rebbe was in Sakonas Nefashos Mamish, Rahman al-San, and this was sort of a tefillah for that. And Nafshi Uchvaydi, and the second time as well, Lirais Nafshi Uchvaydi. You can hear this on the tape. And then the Rebbe did something else. At the end of singing Tzoma L'chol Nafshi by the Olam, the Rebbe sang Tzoma again, this time with the regular words. By Yehila Pella. That was a very big Pella, and then it was only understood about a month later when Shmini Atzeres Lamed Ches came. So basically, Chai Elul was the beginning of Tishrei. Then, shortly after Chai Elul, within a week at the most, is the first night of Slichos. And in the years, the Rebbe spoke, some of the years, the Rebbe mentioned about coming to Slichos, Vakel Dikahet. Vakel Dikahet is the same thing as Shokel Dikahet. Shokel Dikahet means unsteady. That's what Vakel Dik means. Shokel means you're shuckling. And what the Rebbe said, what it meant was that they said L'chaim before Slichos. In other places, they do other things. They have shiurim, or they have Musar schmoozes, and they start crying and screaming and clogging. But by the Rebbe, by Chassidim, the Rebbe always said that coming to Slichos was something that was done b'simcha. And the Rebbe mentioned this in Mem Aleph, And Motzei Shabbos Slichas Memalach was a rikud, like it was really unusual, but that was what happened. That's when it started. But when the Rebbe would come into Slichas, there was an unbelievable seriousness on the Rebbe. That you can see from the pictures, from the videos, of real Ernstkeit. And that's what Rosh Hashanah was like. It wasn't a sad time, but it was a serious time. Yom Kippur. When the Rebbe came into Shul for Kol Nidri, or when the Rebbe came in the morning, or not by Mincha. By Mincha already it was different. But the Rebbe had, on Yom Kippur, but the Rebbe had this Ernstkeit, this seriousness that you can really tell that there's something going on. And most of the years, except in the later years, Nun and Aleph, the Rebbe did not encourage the singing one bit. And the place was really rocking. You know, after a rikud for an hour or two, everybody had said L'chaim, everybody was quite in the excited mood, in the Shokedlika mood. But the Rebbe came in with a very serious cook. Another thing about Chai Elul, just to mention what I said before, was that the Rebbe would write a Michtav Kloli every Tishrei. And in the earlier years, it was one letter. And in the later years, from the Mems already, it was, from the Lamas already, it was 2 letters, sometimes even 3, sometimes even 4 letters of B'nai Yisrael, a letter that the Rebbe sent to everyone. In this letter, the Rebbe developed a theme that was important for that year, Rosh Hashanah. It could have been about Shemitah, and it could have been about Bikurim, and it could have been about Hakhel, and any other thing like that. One year, Tavshin Mentes, the Rebbe wrote a letter, and then on Shabbos Nitzovim, that year was the same kviz as this year. So Rosh Hashanah was on Shabbos, and the Shabbos Nitzovim Bayelech, at the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said a pretty long sikha, a hemshech to the letter. And right after Shabbos, he asked that sikha should be turned into the Michtav Kloli, turned into a letter, written up as a letter. So these were themes, ideas that the Rebbe sent out to everyone that covered the Yomim Nairoim, covered the New Year. And the first one was almost always dated Chai Elul. The second one could have been dated in different ways. It could have been Motzei Shabbos Slichas, it could have been Yemei HaSlichas, it could have been Chof Hei Elul, which is the day the world was created. So a letter would come out. When the letters came out, as we all know, the Michtav Klalim were written in Yiddish, that's the original language in which it was written, and there were lots of ha'aras on the bottom. In these ha'aras, the Rebbe would either be me'ir, make a ha'ara, but another really unusual thing, many people don't realize this. In the ha'aras of the letters of every Michtav Klali, certainly from the Lameds and on, the Rebbe mentioned every single one of the Rabbeim. And not by name necessarily, but by Sefer. There's a reference to every single one of the Rabbeim, including the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid. And there, in the later times, in the mid-Lameds, the Rebbe insisted also having his father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's Sforim, also mentioned. And at some point it was the Arizal, and at some point the Rambam also had to be mentioned in these ha'aras in the letters. In other words, this is a real Rebbeisha gilui. And the Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi Mentlik, Olav Shalom, would stand in the Zal upstairs and he would teach the letter. He would spend hours researching every single one of the Maramakamis and Ha'aras. And when he came, he sat for 2 hours, stood for 2 hours, and would mamish teach the letter and every single Ha'ara. That's a gekocht. He mamish was into it. And that gave everyone a very big impression to take these letters seriously. And they are moedic. They seem to be very simple. They're written for the simple person. But the powerful messages and ideas in them are mamish ein sof, and some of them are really geschmack, they're beautiful. And the Rebbe did this before Tishrei, and or during Tishrei, and the Rebbe did this before Pesach as well. Slichus during the week, every day, was at 7 o'clock. That was the Seder. 7 o'clock was Slichus, 7:30 would be Chassidus in the Bochrim, the Seder of the Bochrim. And the Rebbe usually davened in the weekday according to the Seder of the Bochrim. So the Rebbe would come to Kriya at 10 o'clock because the davening starts at 9:30. The Rebbe would come 3:15 for Mincha, and at 6:45, or in the winter and 9:30 in the summer, because that was the Seder of the Bochrim. The Rebbe lived around the Bochrim. The Bochrim learned in the Rebbe's shul, right upstairs, across the hall from the Rebbe's room. And the Bochrim, those were the ones who surrounded the Rebbe all the time. And so the Rebbe kept that Seder. Even the 9:30 Farbrengen starting in the weekday, which from the middle onwards or so turned to 9:30, was in order to respect the Seder of the Bochrim, that the Seder officially ends at 9:30, as you know. So the Rebbe would come for Slichus every day at 7 o'clock. And that lasted until Mem Zayin. Mem Hey, at the Farbrengen of Erev Rosh Hashanah, Mem Hey was the end of Mem Hey was on a Motzei Shabbos, and the Rebbe sort of spoke about how in Lubavitch we don't get up that early, but in Tismach, when the Rebbe was davening for Lamed, they announced Slichus at 9 o'clock, and the Rebbe was unhappy with that. So 9 o'clock Slichus, 9:30 Shachris, the Rebbe did not accept that, and so they made Slichus at 8 o'clock. And at the Sikha of Gimel Slichus, that's today, and the Sikha that the Rebbe said in Nun Aleph, the Rebbe also referred back to Vayashkem Avraham Babeker, when it says this by the Akedah that we daven every day. So the Rebbe said, Vayashkem Avraham Babeker, Lav Dafka Vayashkem, Lav Dafka Babeker. You talked about starting Slichus a little bit later, and it was sort of a smile type of part of the Sikha. But Slichus generally was 7 o'clock. You had to get up very early. You had to get up like at 6:15 and go to the mikveh. The mikvehs were packed with people, because by 7 o'clock you wanted to be in 770. There wasn't that much of a crowd at 7 o'clock for Slichus. There was, you could have. There wasn't too much pushing. There wasn't a problem for the Rebbe to get in and out like it was on Motzei Shabbos Slichus, where the whole world would come to daven Slichus with the Rebbe. And another thing happened on Slichus in Tafshin Lamed Ches, at the end of Lamed Ches, before Tishrei Lamed Tes. It used to be that the Rebbe accepted Pidyanis on Erev Rosh Hashanah. So Erev Rosh Hashanah would be Slichus, and then the Rebbe would go to the mikveh, and then the Rebbe would come to daven. The Rebbe davened Shachos of the Minyan on Erev Rosh Hashanah every year. And then after that would be Pidyanis. The line would be very long, but the Pidyanis took very, very quickly. The Rebbe would take the Pidyanis very quickly. The line moved very fast. So it was an hour, maybe an hour and a half. But in Lamed Ches, after the Tishrei, in Lamed Ches, so there were different shinuyim in the Rebbe's Hanhoga. For example, the Rebbe did not come for Shachris downstairs until Pesach. The Rebbe davened Shachris and Musaf upstairs in the shul, in the little shul. Pesach, the Rebbe started coming down towards the end of Chazaras Hashatz for Kriya downstairs. So the Rebbe davened in his room, and then the Rebbe would come down for Kriya and Musaf. Farbrengens would all be on Motzei Shabbos. And this was that the Rebbe should not have to strain too much. And then there was a shaila about Tishrei. I remember as a bacher then that there were calls to all the yeshivas that the bachim should not come. There shouldn't be such a big crowd, and there shouldn't be too much of lines for Kesher Bracha and for Lekach and for this. L'Poel, I went, I did go, and for Tishrei, and on Motzei Shabbos Nitzovim, Tafshin Lamed Ches, at the Farbrengen, which is, again, you can listen to it. The Rebbe, towards the end of the Farbrengen, said that the Seder is going to be that from tomorrow, he's going to accept Pidyanis not on Erev Rosh Hashanah, but in the days leading up to Rosh Hashanah, Yemei HaSlichas. And so Yemei HaSlichas, certainly from Gimel Slichas and on, came the time where the Rebbe was Makabel Pidyanis. Now that was really at the beginning of Tishrei, because then you needed to write your Pidyon, and you're asking for Ksila V'Chsimateva, Lashon Teva Masuka, and you're going past the Rebbe, you're filing past the Rebbe. This is serious stuff. You didn't go file past the Rebbe very often, but on Erev Rosh Hashanah, everybody went to give a Pidyon. And so it took a few days. The Rebbe said everybody who was here should immediately go, don't wait until the last minute. Rebbe did the same thing with Lekach from then on. Rebbe did the same thing with Lekach on Erev Yom Kippur. It wasn't only on Erev Yom Kippur, but it was a couple of days before. And also Lekach on Hashanah Rabbah. It wasn't only on Hashanah Rabbah. And then would be Erev Rosh Hashanah. Until Tavshin Lamed Aleph, Va'ad Bechlal, on Rosh Hashanah, and on all the other Yavim Tevim, Sukkot, Simchas Torah, Pesach, and Shavuos, the Rebbe would eat the meals, the Yom Tov meals, together with the Rebbetzin in the Frierdiker Rebbe's apartment, as long as the Frierdiker Rebbe's Rebbetzin was still alive. And there would be a Farbrengen on Rosh Hashanah every year. There would be a Farbrengen on Sukkot every year. There would be a Farbrengen on the second night of Pesach every year. And there would be a Maimer on Shavuos, the first night of Shavuos by night, at 3 o'clock in the morning. After Rosh Hashanah Tavshin Lamed Aleph, after Asara B'Tevis Lamed Aleph, when the Frierdiker Rebbe Rebbetzin passed away, the Rebbe changed the Seder. The Rebbe no longer ate any of the meals in the Frierdiker Rebbe's apartment, as much as the Rashag asked the Rebbe to continue that minhag. The Rebbe went home for the meals. But in this case, things would be, Rebbe never explained it this way, but it would be missing. And so the Rebbe farbrengt on all the Erevs. On Yud Aleph Nisan, the Rebbe started to farbrengt Lamed Aleph, and on Erev Rosh Hashanah, on Erev Sukkot, on Yud Gimel Tishrei, and on Erev Shavuos, there was always a farbrengen from then on, from that time and on. And if it was Shabbos, then it would be sometimes on Motzei Shabbos or a day before or so on. So Erev Rosh Hashanah became now farbrengen, a time for the farbrengen, the last night of the year. That farbrengen was mamish Rosh Hashanah. It was a Rosh Hashanah Dika Maimer. And all the Mamorim of the Rebbe, the Bar Maskal, Yom Tov Shalosh Hashanah Shcholi is B'Shabbos, which is this year, all of those were said on Erev Rosh Hashanah. The Bar Maskal Yom Tov Shalosh Hashanah in Ranat and in Samach Vov was said on Rosh Hashanah, second night of Rosh Hashanah. But the Rebbe said all of his Mamorim of Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And on Rosh Hashanah would be sometimes, normally, a Hemshech to this Maimah. I remember Membeis, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, Toshim Membeis, the Rebbe said a Maimah Yom Tov Rosh Hashanah. And then on Rosh Hashanah itself, a Maimah Adain Eilam, Moededika Mamorim, which were later Mugar, and are in Sefer Mamorim Malukot. But there was always a Maimah in this Farbrengen. And then you really felt Rosh Hashanah. Whoa. I Erev Rosh Hashanah. It wasn't just a Maimer, the Sichos and the Nigunim. Rebbe usually, many times, not usually, but many times asked to sing Avinu Malkeinu, and this type of thing. There was a lot of Simcha. Erev Rosh Hashanah was a Simcha Dika Farbrengen, as was Rosh Hashanah itself, as I'll soon explain. Interesting, very interesting. It was serious, but there was a Simcha there. For example, in Lamed Tes, at the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe said you should sing Kiva Simcha Seitzeu to say goodbye to the year. And this is before the Rebbe left. just to sing the niggin, Kiva Simcha, and he started singing Kiva Simcha, and everyone was clapping. And then before the Rebbe left, again Kiva Simcha Sitzim. So there was a certain simcha, but it was Rosh Hashanah was felt very, very powerful. You just knew coming to this Fabrengen, here we are. Another thing that the Rebbe did several times on Erev Rosh Hashanah was he spoke about the Tzemach Tzedek, whose birthday is on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe 2 or 3 times talked about how the Tzemach Tzedek, had gemacht Paratkes in Petersburg. The Tzemach Tzedek made parades. In other words, he did all kinds of activities from Lubavitch to work things out in Petersburg, in the capital, which was the capital at that time of Russia. Every time the Rebbe said that, something happened in the year within a few days or a week or two. There was Brezhnev, who was the prime minister of Russia. He died, and then his Mamala Makim died the next year, and so on. Just interesting. Another thing that the Rebbe always said on Erev Rosh Hashanah, I don't think there was a year that the Rebbe did not say that, either in the Maimer or in some of the Sichos, one of the Sichos. The Rebbe used to mention the Torah. The Torah says, Eize Umazu, that the Bnei Yisrael, the Am Yisrael, are incredible Ummah, incredible nation, because they leifshim levanim umisatfim levanim umuvtachim shezeichem badin. They wear white and they wrap themselves, they put the talis on, which is white, already on Erev Rosh Hashanah. In other words, you don't wear, you wear your finest clothing. If you're going to a court case, you wear who knows what, shchenim. No, leifshim levanim umisatfim levanim. And because we're sure that you're going to be Zeicher Badin. And the Rebbe would mention this every single year in Rosh Hashanah, to my memory. It could be that one year it wasn't mentioned, but basically that line was mentioned every year. Slichas on Erev Rosh Hashanah would take place in the early years at 6 a.m. Rosh Hashanah was a busy day because everybody went to the oil. In the later years, in my years, and from Lamed Tes, certainly, the Slichus was already at 7 o'clock and would go on until about 8 o'clock. The same chazan for Slichus on Motzei Shabbos was Rabbi Weinberg in all my years, and so he also was the chazan on Erev Rosh Hashanah for Slichus. Slichus would go on for about an hour. The Rebbe would then go to the mikveh, and then the Rebbe would come down for Shachris. There was no real set time for Shachris. The Rebbe just came down for Shachris. And after Shachris, the Zikanim would sit around on a table or on benches near the Rebbe's place, or on the Rebbe's bima, when there was a bima beginning in Tafshil Lamed Daled. And they would go and they would be there for Hataras Nedarim. And the Rebbe would say Hataras Nedarim. And in the years of Shemitah, which is next year, the Rebbe would say the Nusach of the Prusbul. In Tafshin Yud Gimel, by the way, the Rebbe said the Nusach of the Prusbul in Yiddish. Ich gib iber eich zu eich. Aneni meisen lechem. In the later years, the Rebbe said that in Hebrew. And then usually, almost every single year, actually every year, the Rebbe would say Ashekoyach, at least that. And in Nun Beis, the Rebbe said, Erev Shana Tafshin Nun Beis, the Rebbe said a whole Sicha after Hataras Nedarim. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, as mentioned, the Rebbe would take pidyonis, and in the later years, from Lamed Tes and on, the Rebbe would take pidyonis. Then it would be a lot smaller crowd because everybody went before, whoever could, and the Rebbe would take pidyonis from those who didn't come in the days before. And then there would be a pidyon kloli. There'd be a pidyon that would be written asking for brachas for Klal Yisrael, for everyone. This started in the days of the Frierdiker Rebbe and was headed by the Rebbe. And when the Rebbe was Mekabel the Nasius, this was given to the Rebbe every year. And the Rebbe would read the pidyon, and there would be lots of signatures. The Rebbe said only Jungelite, not Bochum, should be involved with this. And no Bochum should be around when they give this pidyon to the Rebbe either. And in the later years, from the beginning of the Mems, maybe mid-Mems, the Rebbe did not read the pidyon. The Rebbe would just accept the pidyon. The Rebbe would say, Mitzat Keitzer Hayem. The Keitzer Hazman, the time was very short. He's not going to read the pidyon, but the Rebbe would give a bracha, and in the bracha he would include everything that was in the pidyon. And this was and in that bracha that the Rebbe gave, it was basically muga every single year. It shows that it was an important, very important bracha that the Rebbe wanted to get out in an official capacity. The Rebbe would go to the Oil and Erev Rosh Hashanah together with others. This was really interesting. The Rebbe would always sit in the front when going to the Oil, in the front of the car, whereas when the Rebbe went back and forth from home and other places, the Rebbe would sit in the back of the car. Every time the Rebbe went to the Oil, the Rebbe sat in the front of the car. In the back of the car, going to the Oil, was usually Rabbi Leib Grona, Rabbi Kazanovsky, Rabbi Chadikov would go along. This was from the earliest days because everybody was going to the Oil on Erev Rosh Hashanah. Everybody went to the Oil on Erev Rosh Hashanah, no matter what. There were buses and mices, everybody would go. And the Rebbe would take along the close people over there. And when the Rebbe got to the Oil, unlike any other time, the Olam would be there. I was there, Kama v'Kama Pomim, on Erev Rosh Hashanah, together with the Rebbe. In fact, I remember one year in Tafshin Mem, when the Rebbe came to the Oil, the Rebbe did not put on sneakers, as the Rebbe usually did before going to the Oil. So the Rebbe took off his shoes outside, as many people do today, and walked in to the Oil. Today, you walk into the Oil without shoes, there's a flat stone floor. In the days before Gimel Tammuz, the Oil had little pebbles on the floor. That's what the Oil, that was the floor of the Oil. And I was just remember the Rebbe grimacing, every step that the Rebbe took onto these little pebbles into the Rebbe's room. And again, you could have been there on Erev Rosh Hashanah, that there was permission given for people to be there. The Rebbe would come home within an hour of Lichtmenschen. And in the later years, after Tismach, after the Rebbetzin passed away, the Rebbe wasn't going home. The Rebbe was staying in his holy cheder in the Rebbe in Gan Eden HaElyon. But there was in Tafshin Mem Tes, Erev Rosh Hashanah Tafshin Mem Tes. The Rebbe said a sikha then about hanging up a tzedakah pushka. If you haven't had one, don't have one yet, do it today before Yom Tov. This was mamash, not too long, maybe a half hour before Shkia. Instructed everybody to go and hang up in the kitchen a tzedakah pushka. And you don't need to do a ganze malacha. You can just stick it up. At least it should be up for Rosh Hashanah. Really interesting. And then came the night of Rosh Hashanah. The night of Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe would come in to the shul, and the Rebbe would immediately sit down. When the Rebbe arrived at his place, the Rebbe would sit down, and the Rebbe would begin to say Tehillim. The Tehillim was not like in a minyan. Everybody said their own Tehillim, whatever Tehillim they were saying. But the Rebbe would sit for 5 or 10 minutes, maybe even a little bit longer, and just say Tehillim before davening. Then the Rebbe would stand up, and if it wasn't a Friday night in the later years, the Rebbe would begin to bang the hand on the shlender in a remez, a simon, to sing Avinu Malkeinu. In the very later years, it didn't happen. But almost all the years, it did, to sing Avinu Malkeinu. The Rebbe once explained that Avinu Malkeinu is a niggin from the Alter Rebbe. It's a niggin verbunden with Rosh Hashanah. And schus ovis, to remind ourselves about the Alter Rebbe, that's why the davening would begin with Avinu Malkeinu. Rosh Hashanah would begin with Avinu Malkeinu, the niggin, just just we didn't say the whole of Vina Malkeinu, all 50, whatever Vina Malkenus there are, but just the Niggun. And then Ma'ariv would start. Rebbe in Shemona Esrei of Rosh Hashanah would daven a little longer than usual. Usually the Rebbe finished Shemona Esrei relatively quickly, but on the first night of Rosh Hashanah, not so quickly. You could have spent your time davening. And at the end of davening, the Rebbe would turn around, and sometimes, in many years, Tafshin Mem, for example, I remember this, which was a Friday night, the Rebbe would go, Good Yontiv, Good Yontiv, Good Yontiv, 3 times, like the Rebbe did on Sukkot and Simchas Torah. That was like a Simchas Torah type of thing. And then the Rebbe would usually announce, Shana Teva Tikosiv, Tikasevu, Tikosiv V'Shichosim, usually Tikosiv V'Shichosim singularly. And started Niggun. And Tafshin Mem, Rebbe started out of B'Chatonim. Other years in Holakenu. His father's Niggun. So, as serious as Rosh Hashanah was, there were two within Rosh Hashanah that were sort of the Simcha. And a lot of Chevra on the first night of Rosh Hashanah, you'd see in 770, davening Barichas, it was, or sitting and saying Tillim, there was a seriousness in 770 like you never saw before. Rosh Hashanah morning, if it was a weekday, that was at a time where you were expecting for Tkiyas. And the rule, unwritten rule, was if you had a place for Tkiyas, and that wasn't so simple, you had to yarshin it or whatever, then you need to be in 770 by 8 o'clock, because a lot of Chevra wanted to go on Mivtzoim, but they didn't want to lose their place. So if you're there by 8 o'clock, you could come back to claim your place. 8 o'clock, 770 was packed. It was never packed 8 o'clock in the morning on any other day, but on Rosh Hashanah, it was packed because nobody wanted to mess with their places on Rosh Hashanah, on Tkiyas. The Rebbe would come into shul on Rosh Hashanah morning, holding, hands were packed. There was one hand that the Rebbe held the shofars. The Rebbe would walk in normally with 3, sometimes 4.
The
class was over. What is this?
Whatever, it doesn't matter.
Of course it matters.
I emailed it to you anyways.
Guys, try to mute yourselves. The Rebbe would come in holding 3 or 4 shofars. The Rebbe had the shofar of the Tzemach Tzedek, that was like a black shofar. You can see these shofars, by the way, in the Rebbe's library. There was also a shofar from the Rebbe Maharash, and there was also a shofar from the Rebbe's father that was sent to the Rebbe by Rabbi Yankov Yosef Raskin in Tafshin Yud. And in Lamed Tes, they bought the Rebbe a shofar because of the Lamed Ches. They bought the Rebbe a shofar that was very, very, very easy. They might have custom made a specific shofar. The Rebbe used that shofar in Lamed Tes and in Tafshin Mem. And Mem Aleph, the Rebbe already did not use that shofar any longer. So there were 3 or 4 shofars, and they were wrapped in like a white handkerchief or 2. It was like wrapped around them, and that's how the Rebbe brought them in to the shul. In the other hand, the Rebbe held his siddur, and the Rebbe also held a siddur from the Arizal, and the Rebbe also held a machzor. So the Rebbe's hands were basically full. Behind the Rebbe were walking Rabbi Grona and Rabbi Klein, and each one of them held 2 or maybe 1 or 2 packages wrapped brown paper with string around them, tied up by string. These, we were told, were the pidyonis. I'm not sure if all the pidyonis were in there. I find it very difficult because in the later years, there were so many thousands of people who sent in pidyonis, either gave into the Rebbe's hand or maybe sent in by mail. Thousands, tens of thousands, and it couldn't fit into the pakalach, to the packages that were being brought into shul. So I never found out how that worked. But we were told always that these were pidyonis, people asking for brachas for a good year. And next to the Rebbe Stender, on the left-hand side of the Rebbe Stender, there would be a table, and the maskinim, Rabbi Grona and Klein, would put down the packages on those tables. The packages were around the Rebbe all the time. And by Tkiyas, these packages would be taken up onto the bima, as we will shortly describe. Davening would begin with Avinu Malkeinu again, unless it was Shabbos, and the later years. And Tavshin Lamed Zayin was also, Rosh Hashanah was on Shabbos, and until that year there was also Avinu Malkeinu on Shabbos. But in Tavshin Mem, when Rosh Hashanah was on Shabbos, there was no more Avinu Malkeinu ever sung on Shabbos. The crowd in front of the bima was just impossible to describe. I, Baruch Hashem, had a place 3 rows back, right in front of the bima, in front of the middle of the bima. In other words, I would be facing the Rebbe directly. And I would never give up on that, but that place brought me so close to the Rebbe, close enough. So I was all the way in the front. Anybody who's around the bima, around the bima in 770, there are tables. Anybody who stood at the table, the people who were standing in the very front, they had to bring with themselves pillows because it was the pressure was so strong, it was so tight. So many people were there. The whole Crown Heights, obviously, even the ones who daven in different shuls would make a break for 2 hours and would go to 770 for tkiyas. Then they would go back to their shuls to finish. But everybody had tkiyas by the Rebbe. The Rebbe was going to blow the shofar. It was packed, just jammed. And everybody wanted to get closer. And so people who were standing in the very front, they had to have pillows, or else there would be a deep indent on their stomachs for a few days. That's how pressured it was. And so because of the pack, it was so packed, ready by Shlishi, which was always the aliyah that the Rashad got, by Shlishi, they would start making a path for the Rebbe to come up to the bima. The Rebbe was going to be called up for maftir. And they had to make a pathway beginning then. It was unbelievable. The pressure, they called it the washing machine because the whole thing would be moving up and down because of so many people being there. But where I was, it was not moving. It was just incredibly tight squeeze, so tight that the floor beneath you became slippery from sweat and from heat. It was like they're mopping the floor. It was soaking wet on the bottom as well. It was hard to keep your feet firmly on the ground. It was so tight. So the Rebbe would come up
Were you able to breathe?
Some people couldn't. In the earlier days, before the air conditioning was made very, very, very strong, there were people who would fall. There were people who would faint. There were people who would have to leave. There was a crowd who couldn't handle it. People whose nefesh habahamis wasn't so strong, they couldn't stand up close. They had to be back a few rows, or maybe even more than a few rows. You can hear everything the Rebbe said. You can hear all the tkiyas that the Rebbe blew. That you could anywhere in the shul. But when you were closer to the Rebbe, you saw the Rebbe's face. You saw the Rebbe's tenuas. There was nothing like that. The closer you were, the more inspiring it was. So people put a lot of pressure on themselves to go there. So you could breathe if you could lift your head up. In the later years, they would get extra air conditioning pipes, like big pipes, and they would pipe air into 770 to make it easy. It still didn't matter. The floor was still wet, but it was at least you can lift up your head and get some fresh air. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the Rebbe said the Kaddish for the Rebbitzon's sister, Rebbitzon's Shana, was murdered in Treblinka on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And so the Rebbe said Kaddish for her on the night and then by day. So the Rebbe didn't wait for Maftir to come to the Bima. The Rebbe came before Maftir, right at the middle of the seventh Aliyah, to be able to say Kaddish right after Kriya. Behind the Rebbe went again Rabbi Groner and Rabbi Klein, carrying the pidyonis, the packages with them. And they held on to those packages. They would put them down on the Bima only before Tkiyas. But in the meantime, the Rebbe is getting maftir. And the Rebbe would be saying the Haftarah. And both days of Rosh Hashanah, the Haftarah is very moving, very emotional stories. And the first day is the story of Chana and her husband Elkanah and Penina, and that she wanted children, and then she went into the Mishkan, and Eli was accusing her of being shikar, and in the end she had a son whose name was Shmuel, because she was going to give him to Hashem. Don't forget, the Rebbe's mother's name was Chana, and she passed away, and her says to make tshuva. And the Rebbe would often cry, bechiyas, in the different tefillas that Chana would call out to Hashem. Also, on the second day, there's some very beautiful description from Yirmiyah Hanavi about the Yidden and the end of Golus, and the words "V'shovu bonim ligvulam," the children will come back home, and Koyamar Hashem, Koy Baroma Nishma. There, it starts with Koyamar Hashem, but Koy Baroma Nishma. Rachel is crying about for her children who are in Golus, and some beautiful parts over there. There's some very emotional parts, and the Rebbe would cry already by the Haftarah. In the later years, from the Mems and on, were very little bechiyas. Sai in the Farbrengens and Sai in the Haftarahs, just in Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe said Haftarahs. All the Haftarahs that the Rebbe said were in a very soft and calm and beautiful song. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a laning like a kriya. They were very soft. And unless you stood close, you didn't hear Haftarah very well, unless you had a place. And there was a Stupanish for Haftarah every Shabbos. But in Rosh Hashanah, it was the beautiful words of Chana and all that. By the way, they had special machzorim. We would hold, you couldn't have these big machzorim. We'd have a little pocket machzorim this big that you were able to keep in your pocket, or you were able to hold in your hand just enough in this crowd. If you didn't have a pocket machzor, you're in trouble. You couldn't come with those big machzorim. When the Haftarah was over, in Kaddish, Yisrael v'yem hazikaron, the Rebbe would take the pidyon. The Rebbe would look back, and Rabbis Groner and Klein would put the pidyonis down on the bima, and they would be so that the bima was pretty big. The Sefer Torah, of course, was not on anymore, and the pidyonis would be placed at the end of the bima, and the Rebbe was standing in the middle of the bima. The Rebbe would then take his talus and lift it up over his head and place it, like throw it, over the entire bima. And the Rebbe went down. You saw that the Rebbe's figure under the talus was down with the pidyanis, with those packages. One of the more amazing scenes, and there was a pin drop. Thousands of people in 770. It was quiet. The only thing you heard was the fans. The fan whizzing, blowing. That's it. It was complete silence in the entire 770. And all you had was the Rebbe, like, bent over a bima under the talus. Sometimes for 20, 30 seconds. Sometimes for a minute, and sometimes longer. There were certain years when the Rebbe stayed down quite a long time, and you would hear mamish bechias, sobs, wails coming from the Rebbe. The entire bima would be shaking. The whole talus you would see would be shaking sometimes. And then the Rebbe would lift up the talus, but only to the Rebbe's eyes. You saw almost always the Rebbe's face was red, and many times there were tears. Even if you didn't hear the Rebbe crying, there were tears like on the Rebbe. And the Rebbe would, by holding the talus just over his eyes, the Rebbe would like burst out. Lam natseach livnei keirach mizmer. Just like that. And it was like a shudder went through. Because in the Haftarahs, the Rebbe was soft and quieter. Here, the Rebbe was like a chazan. And it was a cry. It wasn't just Lam Natseach Livnei Kerech, it was the Rebbe saying it. And I remember every year like a shiver going through, even though you knew what was coming. When you heard that, you were transported by that. The Rebbe would then take the talus and do the same thing. You'd go right under the talus over the pidyanis, and the Rebbe would stay under the talus to say the 7 times Lam Natseach Livnei Kerech. The Olam was davening. It was loud. And little by little, everybody finished the 7 times Lam Natseach, and the Rebbe stayed under. And it was again silent. Everyone knew that this is big time in Shemayim, and we're watching Ba'aretz, we're watching something amazing. I forgot one thing. Before Kriya, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas Katz, who was one of the Gaboim in 770, would make an announcement. And he would say, this Kriya is coming now, and then there's going to be Hachonis to Tkiyas, and there's going to be the Tkiyas themselves, and by the laning, by the Haftarah, by this, nobody should stand in any boxes, they shouldn't be pushing, everybody should stay where they are. And he used to always finish off with this line. Everybody should know where you are standing and before whom you are standing. It didn't help. I mean, there were still boxes and mices all over the place, but this was part of the Rosh Hashanah scene. Anyway, the Rebbe's under the talus, and it's quiet in 770, just complete silence, utter silence. It's hard to imagine that. Thousands of people, and just the Rebbe is under the talus over there, standing high on the bima, and under the entire bima is under the Rebbe's talus. The Rebbe would then, at the end of, when the Rebbe finished the 7 mizmairim, the Rebbe would lift up the talus, and the Rebbe would hold it so that his eyes were covered. Not completely mamish, but the Rebbe's eyes were looking down on the siddur, but you couldn't see the Rebbe's eyes, most of the Rebbe's eyes. And holding the talus like this, the Rebbe would say the psukim. Min ha-meitzar korosiko ononi v'merchavko. And the Olam would repeat after the Rebbe. Keli shim'o kechazdecho Hashem kemishpatecho chayeni. Like slow with the niggin, and sometimes the Rebbe would stop. Sometimes the Rebbe would break down and cry. Sometimes the Rebbe would change somewhat of the words of the psukim. And one year, I think it was in Tismach, the Rebbe said, Arayv avdecha l'toiv. And the Rebbe, the next word is Al Yashkuni Zaydim. These are psukim from Kuf Yates, so we should be familiar with them. But the Rebbe didn't say Al Yashkuni Zaydim. The Rebbe said Bal Yashkuni Zaydim. And there were other things like this. And then the final pasuk, Allah Elikim Bisrua Adai Shem Bekel Shayfa. And then, when those psukim were over, the Rebbe would again go under the talus just for a very short while. There's a yidotzen that is said then by the person who blows. Just 1 second. By the Baal Tekeah, there's a yidotzen that is said. And then, some years the Rebbe did this here. Many of the years the Rebbe did this before. What did the Rebbe do? The Rebbe would make a seder with the shofars. This was one of the more himmeldike things that we ever saw. The Rebbe had the shofars lying on the right-hand side. And the Rebbe had these tichelach. The Rebbe had these like handkerchiefs. There was a white one, and there was a red one, and there was another white one. And the Rebbe wanted to wrap all the shofars in these 3 tichelach. And sometimes the Rebbe put the white, red, and white, and sometimes it was different, and sometimes it didn't quite close. The Rebbe would sometimes spend 3 or 4 minutes on this. This was also everybody would like try to see, like, what is the Seder over here? Nobody can figure out what the Seder was. This was also a very unique thing about covering the shofars with these tichelach. And one of these tichelach, at least one of them, were from one of the Rabbe'en. Then the Rebbe would make the brachas. Baruch atah Adai Shem Elokeinu melech ha'olam asher kilishonu b'mitzvos v'tzivonu l'shmeya kel shofar. And a roar from the entire crowd. Amen. Baruch atah Adai Shem Elokeinu melech ha'olam shehecheyanu v'kiyamanu v'higi'anu lizman hazeh. And again, Amen. And then the Rebbe would blow the tkiyas. The makri, the person who appointed, would be Rabbi Shmuel Levitin, who passed away at the end of Tafshin Lamed Daled. And Lamed Hey and Lamed Vov and Lamed Zayin, there was no makri, but in Lamed Ches, the Rebbe asked Rabbi Tenenbaum, who would be the one who blew the shofar the rest of the tkiyas after the 30 tkiyas from Yusuf, after the 30 at this point. The Rebbe asked him to be the makri. It might have been Lamed Tes, but he was the makri from then on. At the end, after the tkiyas, the Rebbe would say the 3 psukim in this way. Also, so melodic, so sweet, so beautiful. Ashrei ha'om yedei seru'ah adei shem be'ei ponecha yehalechun. That was the first pasuk. The next pasuk, B'shimcha, Rebbe would raise the tone. B'shimcha yigilun kol hayim, u'b'tzidkascha yadumu. And then most of the years, the Rebbe would raise the tone again for the third pasuk. Ki siferes uzomei ata, u'v'tzeinecha tarum karneinu. Those were the three psukim. Shtapchas and nefesh, just phenomenal. That you just the wrap up of Tkiyas that way was just so beautiful. Then the Rebbe would say Ashrei, wouldn't say Ashrei loud, just start saying Ashrei right at the bima, and then the Rebbe would follow the Sifrei Torah down. The Sifrei Torah went to the left side of the bima. Usually when the Rebbe went off the bima, the Rebbe went to the right side. The Rebbe turned around and went down the right side because the Rebbe came from the left side. But this time, in honor of the Sifrei Torah, the Rebbe went down following the Sifrei Torah on the left-hand side. The Rebbe would always point to Rabbi Tannenbaum to take a shofar, take one of the shofars, to choose a shofar to blow for the rest of the davening, and he always took the shofar that the Rebbe used. By the way, there were certain years where Tkiyas just didn't go, and there was shvach, it was hard. Especially, you found that especially on the first day. And sometimes they went murderdik. In Nun Beis, for example, they were smooth as it can be. And in other years, Lamed Daled, there were other years that were very, very difficult. Sometimes I ever spent a lot of time trying to blow, especially the Tkiyah Gedela at the end. Another thing about Tkiyas, the Rebbe blew Teruas in the Tkiyah, about 70 Teruas. And not fast, not but about 70 of those. Rebbe's face would turn very red, like all Bali Tekeah. Those are just a couple of the things. Tkiyah Gedela was not that long. Wasn't a Gedela Mamish. It was a little longer than the rest of them. All right. The Rebbe would come back, the Sifrei Torah would be put back, the Rebbe would come back to his place and put down the Siddur and the Machzor, and then the Rebbe would do something that was very, very unusual. There was in Kabbalah, it talks about how the Baal Tekeah, his face should be seen by all the people after the Tkiyas. It's called Hachzaras Ponim, to turn around your face. And the Rebbe would do that. It's not in Sefer HaMinhagim, because the Rebbe once explained that it's not a Chabad minig, it's a minig api Kabbalah. And the Rebbe would do a whole like Boye B'Shalom, a whole L'Chadedi. The Rebbe would turn around from the left, turn around and go all the way around. Sometimes the Rebbe did that very quickly. Sometimes the Rebbe took a little longer time to go around. Everybody would be jumping up to see, catch a glimpse of the Rebbe's holy face. Musaf, on Rosh Hashanah, the only thing that really stands out, in addition to obviously the Geschmack and everything else, was two main things. Number one, by Kriya, by V'anachnu Kodim V'Mushtachabim, the Rebbe would do that very quickly, and get up very, very quickly. And another thing is by Birchas Kohanim, the Rebbe would go off the bima, and many of the Kohanim went onto the Rebbe's bima. The Rebbe would stand, there was a little cutout on the Rebbe's bima. The Rebbe would stand at that cutout, and the Rebbe would stay there until the end of the final 30 Tkiyas at the very end of davening. And the Rebbe did not say, the only time they went off the bima was when the Rebbe said, Yashikayach Kohen. The Rebbe wouldn't speak until the final Tekiah completely. In other words, not just after the 100 Tekiyahs, but after the Lamed Kailis that we blow at the end, after Tilim, after davening. Only then would the Rebbe turn to the Kohanim and say, Yashkach Kohen, and all the Kohanim would go down, then the Rebbe would go back on the bima and leave. So that's the davening. It was basically a repetition on the second day of Yom Tov. Was the same idea. Tashlich being the first day, if it wasn't Shabbos, like this year, which obviously was on Sunday, there was always a big crowd, but they wouldn't let people go. They would close off. The Rebbe would go together with the Maskirim and some Miyuchosim. The Rebbe would say Tashlich pretty quickly, and the Rebbe would go back in, and the whole Crown Heights would come there because that was really the only place to do Tashlich. With thousands of people streaming around the stream. And then the Farbrengen. The second day of Rosh Hashanah was always a Farbrengen. This is a Chiddush from the Rebbe, and when the Rebbe did it the first time in Tashin Yud Beis, the Rebbe said that this is a Chiddush. He wants everybody to wash and be Mamshech Rosh Hashanah into the evening. At this Farbrengen, several things were featured that were totally only at this Farbrengen. Number one, the Rebbe would say a Maimer every single year, the Rosh Hashanah Dika Maimer, and the Maimer would be a long Maimer. Even in the later years where the Maimorim were not that long, the Rosh Hashanah was a long Maimer. And in the Maimer, the Rebbe would bring from all the Rabbeim, including the Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid, and in the later years, his father as well. And it was a Rosh Hashanah Dika Maimer. Very, with a lot of hezbollah, with a lot of enthusiasm. The Rebbe would really sort of, if you can say this, like into this Maimer. The Rebbe was always into the Maimer, but this one was different. The Rosh Hashanah Dika Maimer was different. So this always took place at this Farbrengen. And another thing took place beginning in Tafshin Tes Vav. The Rebbe started to introduce the singing of all the nigunim of the Rabbeim. This was something really, really spectacular. It was a completely unusual, irregular, not regular thing. And there was different snorim. Sometimes the Rebbe would say to sing most of them, sometimes all of them, sometimes with a seder, and sometimes like scattered through the Farbrengen, sometimes backwards. Like in Tafshin Lamed, which was also a Shabbos Sunday that year, the Rebbe asked first to sing his own niggin, and then it went back until the Alter Rebbe's niggin. So things had different. But beginning in Lamed Aleph or Beis, it basically was the regular Seder, beginning from the Shalosh Tnuas all the way into the Rebbe. And there was always the niggin of the Rebbe involved as well. Ata B'Chatonu was usually the niggin for the Rebbe. And one year in Tafshin Mem Hey and in Tafshin Mem Ches as well, it was Rosh Hashanah was a Thursday, Friday. And so the Rebbe said that the Fridays, connected to Shabbos, they should sing nigunim without words. And so for the Rebbe's niggin, there's only one niggin from the Rebbe without words, and that's Shamil's niggin. And singing the nigunim of all the Rabbeim, the Rebbe mentioned several times over the years that this is a way of bringing in the Rabbeim, the Zechus Ovis, into Rosh Hashanah. And it was moiridik. The Rebbe's truas during the nigunim were very serious. The Rebbe many times had like the eyes, the Rebbe was not really there. And there was this ernstkeit, this seriousness that was really, really special. You know, these nigunim, some of them are really powerful nigunim. And they were all sung. And then came Ata B'Chatonu, and the roof came down. The Rebbe would usually shake with the head to encourage the niggin. The place was rocking. It was really, really, so that, the Ata B'Chatonu of Rosh Hashanah was usually very, very special. Another thing about this Farbrengen was it was always very short. The longest Farbrengen, I believe, was 3 hours. Usually they were about 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Unlike Simchas Torah, and unlike Achon Shel Pesach, and unlike Shavuos, those Farbrengens went on for 6, 7, even more hours. The Farbrengen Rosh Hashanah never lasted more than 3 was unusually long. It was a short Farbrengen, and with that, with the Maimah and with the Nigunim, it was just maybe 2 or 3 sichas. It was short. And some years, another thing about this Farbrengen, it was very, very Lebedik. Here's an example. The Rebbe would, Mizman Lizman, the Rebbe would, at the big Farbrengens, like Yites Kislev and stuff like that, the Rebbe would sometimes jump up and dance. That was one of the more amazing things. The place went crazy when that would happen. And in the Lamas, it was a few times in the year. Lamed Hey once, Lamed Vav once, Lamed Zayin once. Then came Lamed Ches. Obviously, Lamed Ches, the Rebbe was, not in this full. Rebbe was healing. But in Tavshin Lamed Tes, twice the Rebbe stood up to dance. And then the Rebbe did not stand up to dance again until Tavshin Mem Vav. That's over 6 years. And on Rosh Hashanah Tavshin Mem Vav, at the end of the Farbrengen, the Rebbe asked that everybody should say L'chaim, and they should sing a Simchas Torah Dikenigen, or Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe said it's not Simchas Torah today, but still there has to be a lot of Simcha. And they sang the Rebbe's father's nigun, and the Rebbe stood up to dance for the first time, and we brought back that incredible tnua of the Rebbe dancing. It was Rosh Hashanah Mem Vav, then Leil Simchas Torah Mem Vav, Shabbos Bereshis Mem Vav, and a couple more times. There's Vav Tammuz in the weekday, and the Mem Zayin. And then the Rebbe stood up several times a year after that. But Rosh Hashanah, Rebbe stood up to dance, and that wasn't the only Rosh Hashanah where the Rebbe stood up to dance. There were other years as well. Tashrim Mem Ches and Tismach, after the Maimer, Diba Maskal Vayichulu Hashemayim Haaretz on Rosh Hashanah. And the Rebbe said they should sing Hu Elokeinu, and the Rebbe stood up to dance Hu Elokeinu on Rosh Hashanah. And there was other years before that as well. And then came, the Rebbe would wash, of course, for Rosh Hashanah, and then the Rebbe would give Kesher Bracha. After the Farbrengen, the Rebbe would bench. Then there would be Havdalah, Ma'ariv, and then Havdalah, and then after Havdalah, the Rebbe would give out Kesher Bracha. The Kesher Bracha on Rosh Hashanah was quite small, much smaller crowd. Simchas Torah could have gone on for 4 or 5 hours, just Kesher Bracha. And on Rosh Hashanah, it wasn't that kind of crowd. A lot of people didn't go because they were going to go Simchas Torah, just to take it easy on the Rebbe, if you will. All I can say is that Rosh Hashanah with the Rebbe was so powerful and so strong, and it was something that you took with you for the rest of the year. Obviously, not everybody can be there, and if you had a choice to make, most people came for Simchas Torah, not for Rosh Hashanah. But Rosh Hashanah was a central time of the year. And the Rebbe's, by standing by Tkiyas, there was no way you could not have had a Hiddur Tshuva and want to be a better chassid and a better person, and make a hachlata standing right there and there. And I'll finish with this story. Somebody came, didn't have any children, came for Tkiyas. And it was very different. The Rebbe was not being able to blow the Tkiyah Gedela. And the Rebbe went under the talus again, and under the talus, like working on this. And this guy said that I'm sure the Rebbe is working now to bring me a child, give me a bracha. And I'm making a hachlata right here that if I'm blessed with a child, I'm going to bring this child with me next year for Rosh Hashanah. And that's what happened. Right after that, the Rebbe stood up and blew the Tkiyah Gedela. And he had a baby. He came Rosh Hashanah, and he came by for Keshel Bracha by the Farbrengen. He brought the baby with him, and he said, "Here's the baby." The Rebbe said, "No, this is the Tkiyas kind. This is a child that came from Tkiyas." So you can imagine, if that's just one story, you can imagine what the Rebbe was doing in Beis Din Shalmaila on behalf of Klal Yisrael on Rosh Hashanah every year. And it's no question that the Rebbe, the Beis Din Shalmaila these days, is pulling for us, especially all of us who wrote Pidyanis and are asking for Hashanah Tova. And we realize when you hear Tkiyas this year, close your eyes or open them and look at a picture of the Rebbe. And try to imagine that the Rebbe at this moment in Beis Din Shalmaila is davening on your behalf. And so it should give you a certain inspiration to be a better chassid and to be a better yid and to be a better person in yourself. That should be the inspiration that you get, because this is happening these days even more. But the real truth is, let's hope that we don't have to worry about that, because before Rosh Hashanah, way before Rosh Hashanah, it should be the Isgalus of Mashiach Tzidkenu, and we should be able to be in the Beis HaMikdash listening to the Tkiyas of the Rebbe on Shabbos. Take it from Miyad Mamash.
Amen.
Amen.
I'm being asked, can we please go through all the psukim, how the Rebbe would say them? Are you Rabbi Shmuel Lew's son? Yes, I am. Are we getting tested on this? If you want to test me, you can test me.
Rabbi Dice.
If you want to hear how the Rebbe said the psukim before Tkiyas, this is basically how the Rebbe said them. Again, there were shinuyim here or there, sometimes smaller shinuyim, sometimes changes in the words as well. Min ha-meitzar korosika ononi b'merchavko keili shim'a kechazdecha Hashem kemishpatecha chayeni reish tevorcha emes ולעולם כל משפט צדקך ערב עבדך לטוב. Now, sometimes the Rebbe went like this. Al yashkuni zaydim. And other times the Rebbe went, Al yashkuni zaydim. But most times it was, Al yashkuni zaydim. Sos anechi al imrosecha kemeitzei shalom rav tuv tam vodas vamdeini ki v'mitzveisecha he'emanti nirveis pi Retzeino ad Hashem u'mishpatecha lamdeini Olo Elokim bisruah ad Hashem b'kel shofar. All right, guys. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to bring with you. Thank you. On the most thing that so sits in my neshama, as I'm sure it does with everybody who was zeicher to be there. And I hope that it can rub off on you, that you should be able to feel the Rebbe if Rahman and Hashem doesn't come before them. We have a ksiva, chsimateva, lashonateva, masuka, begashmis,